Castlevania. A very terrific video game series that's in a ton of people's hearts. A true classic to many. I have not played the first game on the NES, but I did play the Curse of Darkness demo on PS2 many years ago as a kid. I didn't even know it was a Castlevania game though, since I never knew the series at the time. It wasn't until years later that I got to get my first true Castlevania experience with Castlevania 64. I loved it. Such a wonderful game. I tried out Legacy of Darkness a few months ago, and consider it my favorite Castlevania game of all time. Sadly, the game isn't what today's video will be about. Today what I'm going to do is give my thoughts on Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Before I start, I'll give a little history of it to you all. Originally the game was simply named Lords of Shadow, and took no connection to Castlevania. Before LOS, there was a Castlevania game announced, which Igarashi was going to be the director of yet again. Series fan favorite, Alucard, was going to be the protagonist in the game. However, that project was cancelled in favor of Lords of Shadow, which then became the new Castlevania title. Iga then left Konami, leaving CV in the hands of someone else. Konami decided to give the IP to a team called Mercury Stream, the ones who were developing Lords of Shadow. It marks the first time a Castlevania game was not made by a Japanese team. Lords of Shadow was led by Hideo Kojima, the same man who did the Metal Gear Solid games. Released on the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and for the first time in Castlevania history, PC. It was made as a reboot to the series, but became its own universe, and is non-canon to the main entries. Originally the main protagonist was going to be Simon Belmont, but has changed to a different character called Gabriel Belmont. Instead of being a Zelda or classic vanilla entry like previous games, the devs decided to make it a 3D action game similar to Devil May Cry. This game drew inspiration from Super Castlevania 4, with a theme from one of the levels in the game and the ability to swing around with your whip. Although, the ability to do that has already returned in Harmony of Despair for Julius Belmont. I'll explain the gameplay and features. While I have not played Devil May Cry 1, Lords did play like it. Actually, it's more like a different take on Castlevania The Man of Innocence, a 3D Zelda that's like Devil May Cry. It came after DMC1 and before the original God of War. I have not played that game either, but I've seen a bit of gameplay footage. In LOS you go around through levels killing enemies and solve puzzles at certain points. You learn new moves by spending experience points on them. A feature taken from past entries is going back to areas you've been with new items, to unlock a new path you couldn't access before. There is a problem with it though, but I'll get to that later on. As a Belmont, your main weapon is a whip. In LOS it's not called the Vampire Killer, but rather the Combat Cross. Why they named it that I'm not sure, but it feels odd. You can do different combos with it. You also have the ability to block attacks and roll. Lords of Shadow has sub-weapons like in every other Castlevania game. However, they have been handled differently here. Instead of picking one up from destroying candles and objects like in many CV games, you get them from cutscenes and scripted sequences, and keep them with you at all times. Unlike Harmony though, you can't decide what sub-weapons to take with you. In Lords you have them all at once. Speaking of sub-weapons, it's the second Castlevania game where hearts or jewels do not serve as ammunition, and the first to not have either of them at all. In Lords of Shadow you have to pick up the sub-weapons to fill back up. It's also that first Castlevania game in where they're called secondary weapons rather than sub-weapons. You can increase the capacity of every sub-weapon by finding upgrades throughout each level. That's all you can do though. You can't upgrade their strength and ability like in Legacy of Darkness and Harmony of Despair. There is one sub-weapon that gets affected by an ability, and that is the knife. I'll get to the part next. A few of these weapons are used to solve puzzles. I'll get to the puzzle part soon. In this game, you have light and shadow magic. Once acquired, you can activate them. Gabriel will let out an aura representing the magic. Light is blue, and shadow is red. Attacking enemies or using relic power attacks drains the magic gauges at the left and right bottom corners of the screen. Light magic heals you, while shadow magic does more damage to enemies. You start off with low gauges for your magic, and must find crystals and levels to increase their capacity. Remember when I mentioned that the knife gets affected by an ability? Well, with shadow magic, the knife becomes stronger. So the game went back to having linear levels rather than having a big map for you to explore. They're put in chapters. However, not all of the levels are linear. Some of them require you to explore in order to proceed, such as the garden maze, for example. Parts of certain levels are blocked off, and require items and abilities in order to get through them. Remember when I mentioned that there's a problem with it? Well, here's the thing. As I mentioned, this game uses levels instead of a big map, so to get back to these areas you have to go to the chapter in the world map and select the level it isn't to get back to. It makes me wonder why they didn't make the game a Zelda-vania to begin with. There's puzzles to solve in some levels. You'll be rewarded if you solve them yourself, but there's the option to let the game give you the solution at the price of your reward. There's a nice mini-game you can unlock called Vampire Wargame. You can play it with a friend. It's like chess, but in a different way. Now that I've talked about the gameplay, I'll mention the art style. The style for LOS is different. There's people who said it was a return to form. That's not true. Castlevania never looked Western to begin with. People had the idea that CD was a Western-looking game because of the cover art for Castlevania 1. The sprites and style in the game were based off the Japanese manual for Castlevania. I'm not saying it's wrong to like Western art styles. What I'm saying is the Castlevania didn't have that style to begin with. Simon was never a barbarian. Lords of Shadow was the second game in a series to have a Western art style. The first being Super Castlevania 4. I should mention that compared to other CD games, LOS is probably more story-heavy. This part I'm going to talk about will have major spoilers, so I suggest skipping this if you haven't finished the game. If you have finished, you can go ahead and listen. Here we go. So the final boss of the game isn't even Dracula. That's right, Dracula is nowhere to be found. Instead you fight Satan. The fight wasn't even hard if you knew what to do at the part where he recovers and you have to go through the rings shown. What happened to Dreg? Well, it's at the very end that you find out Gabriel has somehow turned into a vampire. But not just any vampire. He became Dracula himself. A Belmont as Dracula? Dear gosh. If you want to know how this happened, you'll have to play the Reload DLC. Which now gets me to my next point. Playable characters. Unless you got Gregory, you're just Gabriel. In Castlevania games before Lords of Shadow, there were extra characters to play as. Harmony of Despair may have DLC characters, but there are 5 to play as by default. Remember when these things were unlockables? So now that I've talked about all of those things, I'm going to mention some flaws this game is. Okay. One of the flaws is hand-holding. Hand-holding? In a Castlevania game? Why? Another flaw is the addition of modern-day checkpoints. Why add them in? Then there's unskippable scenes, which ties in with hand-holding. You finish level, which means you've seen everything. You play it again and they show you something from it again, and you can't skip the scene. Labyrinth entrance, for example. I go to the gate at the beginning. I have to tap the grab button, and it'll freeze me in place to tell me that goblin grenades won't do anything to the door. I know that, so why not let me skip the tip? Fourth flaw is a personal thing. Lack of extra playable characters in the base game. Fifth, messing up characters from past entries in this. What have they done to Cornell? 6 is how boss battles were handled in this game. They felt automatic. 7 is the inclusion of quick time events. And 8 is the whip swing feeling automatic. You don't truly feel like you're swinging yourself. There's something I have to say that another user on YouTube mentioned about the game years ago, and that is the amount of gore used in LOS. There was too much. Well, not as much as Lords of Shadow 2, but still a lot. Not even Lament of Innocence had that much gore, and that was the first M-rated Castlevania game. What do you think of the gore in the game? Is it too much or is it fine? I'll quickly mention how Gabriel is. Okay, so he acts more like a brute than a Belmont. He's a lot more violent and cold. His methods are just odd. Okay, so now I'll tell you what I think of Lords of Shadow. Well, to me, it's not Castlevania. Not because it's not like Symphony of the Night, but because it felt off in different ways. It's also a step backwards compared to Legacy of Darkness. LOD has more playable characters, great gameplay, doesn't hold your hand, has more sub-weapons, lets you upgrade those sub-weapons, the modern-day checkpoints, has a day and night cycle like Simon's Quest, terrific soundtrack, and more. On its own, it's a fun game. As Castlevania, it's very off. It should have been its own game series as originally intended. I hope we someday get a new 3D Castlevania game in the style of Legacy of Darkness. That would be so awesome. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm thinking on making more Castlevania videos in the future. Even one where I tell my ideas for a new entry into the series. Have a good day.